In this video, we're taking a look at AMD's new-ish 7600 XT, their 16GB entry into $330 graphics card space, up against the 6700 XT, which originally had a very different MSRP, but now sells for about $330. I have the AMD reference model 6700 XT and the ASRock Challenger 7600 XT. And the interesting thing we're seeing is basically, well, it's not that exciting when you get a new graphics card that performs slower than another one that's been available for a long time at the same price point. Now, with that being said, it's harder to get 6700 XTs right now. So let's look at the current pricing real quick before we jump in any further. So if I want to buy a new 7600 XT, they are widely available at their $330 MSRP. And if I want to buy a 6700 XT, well, there's not so many models in stock at the $330 price anymore. But that being said, I still can buy this last generation product at $330, and I've been able to for like a year now, maybe more. And not only that, but over the course of the last year or so, it's even occasionally seen sales as low as $299. So with that in mind, it's kind of, like I said, it puts the 7600 XT in a rough spot. And this isn't the only time we've seen AMD have this issue in this generation, where one of their newer generation products, like for example, the 7700 XT, is coming in, and it's already has its price dropped from its $450 original MSRP, because AMD's own last generation 6800 costs less, performs similarly, and has more VRAM. Now, in this video, again, looking at the 7600 XT against the 6700 XT, the VRAM situation is actually flipped generationally. So the new card does have 16 gigabytes of VRAM versus the previous generation 6700 XT. I think dyslexic people are going to hate this comparison. But anyway, the 6700 XT previous generation product coming in at 12. Now, both of these are a lot more than 8, which is generally what NVIDIA is offering in this price point. And while 8 is often kind of not quite enough for a lot of the newer games' top-end graphic settings, 12 usually is. Or is it? I mean, let's take a look at it at this video, right? We'll see if that causes any issues. Also, apologies when I was testing out RoboCop Rogue City, which is an Unreal Engine 5 game, one of the reasons why I'm starting here. Looks like I actually had my settings set a little bit different between the two GPU display outputs. I think I got that fixed up after testing this game on the 6700 XT, so they should look the same. So sorry, in this particular matchup, they're a little out of whack, but I also want to mention real quick, power consumption. So AMD's last generation 6000 series GPUs don't report power consumption the same way that the newer generation 7000 series do. The 7000 series is pretty much reporting the entire power usage of the graphics card, whereas the previous generation, I think, was just like reporting like the GPU die itself and maybe not including the VRAM, things like that. So while they're showing about the same power draw here, the 6700 XT from the previous generation is actually drawing a bit more power than what's reported to the software. Anyway, it looks like in 1080p, Unreal Engine 5, RoboCop Rogue City, we are seeing the 6700 XT take a 14% lead, giving it a bit over 60 FPS at the max settings, versus the 7600 XT being a bit under 60 FPS. I'm tinying out of the way now. Let's go ahead and roll some more benchmarks. So what if we drop down to the high settings, since the 7600 XT was, a bit under 60 FPS there, and this is a first-person shooter. Well, now both GPUs are doing better. We're now getting 68 and 75 respectively, but that is a 10% advantage to the older generation product. So again, they cost about the same. Older generation product is running a bit faster. Now let's jump into 1440p. At 1440p epic settings, so it's all maxed out, neither GPU is doing great. We're at 41 versus 36, so probably not the way you would play a first-person shooter on either GPU, but we are seeing a 14% advantage to the last generation product. with the 6700 XT. The 1% lows are also a 13% advantage. But like I said, probably weren't the settings you would use to play the game. Unreal Engine 5 scales a lot based on resolution. So if you lower the rendering resolution using FSR quality, we're now seeing 63 FPS versus 56, so they're both a lot more around that 60 FPS mark now, but still a 13% advantage to the 6700 XT. I don't love the look of FSR in this game, so I'd probably recommend actually switching over to Unreal Engine 5's TSR for your actual use case here. But another option, if you don't want to upscale, would be to try to turn down graphics settings. So if you turn down to the high settings at 1440p, we're now seeing a 14% advantage for the 6700 XT, but it's 49 FPS versus 43. So probably, a lot of people would still want a higher frame rate here. You could kick on more upscaling, something like that. And let's go ahead and move on to Avatar. So this is one of the best looking games out there right now, and it also uses ray tracing at all times. So this is a ray tracing benchmark, and at 1080p Ultra, neither GPU is delivering, super high frame rates. We're at 49 versus 42, which is a 17% advantage to the 6700 XT. And if we move down to the high settings, I actually see the advantage grow to a 20% lead. And now the 6700 XT is well over 60 FPS at 66, whereas the 7600 XT is actually still below a 60 FPS result at 55. Although this is one of the more demanding areas of the benchmark. So, in much of the game, you would be 60 FPS or above at 1080p high. If we move up to 1440p Ultra settings, well, now we see an even larger win for the 6700 XT. It's taking a 25% advantage, but it's not doing well itself, right? It's at 35 FPS versus 28 on the 7600 XT, so not amazing there. So even the 1% lows are a 25% advantage, but again, probably not how you'd play the game on either GPU. If you kick on FSR to the quality settings, both GPUs gain a lot of performance, but we're still not hitting 60 FPS. It's 51 on the 6700 XT and 43 on the 7600 XT. That's a 19% advantage. And the 1% lows are also a 19% advantage at 43 versus 36. So, I think we'd want to adjust settings a bit more from there. So if we go down to the high settings, but with no upscaling, we're still under the 60 FPS mark at 45 and 38 respectively. It's an 18% advantage for the 6700 XT in the averages. The 1% lows are a 15% advantage at 38 versus 33. So, still not quite what we're looking for. So I think we're going to need to try out some upscaling as well. So if we go down to the high settings and use FSR quality, now we're kind of, again, seeing, it's interesting how much this is happening, where we find settings where the 6700 XT is a bit above 60 and the 7600 XT is a bit below 60. It's a 20% performance lead for the 6700 XT at 65 versus 54 FPS, and the 1% lows are 54 versus 45. Now, if we decided to use frame generation in this game, we could definitely boost the motion fluidity. Keep in mind that that's not boosting responsiveness and also introduces its own image quality artifacts. The biggest issue in this game is the HUD elements not updating at the higher refresh rate, which can look a little bit distracting. But you can get a high refresh rate experience here on both. Although, again, keep in mind, generated frames aren't the same thing as achieving them natively, and it was a 19% advantage for the 6700 XT. Let's move on to Alan Wake 2. Now, here we're actually seeing much closer performance in the averages, and the 7600 XT is winning by 2 FPS, which gives it a 4% advantage at 52 versus 50. But check out, just for a second here, I'm going to point out, okay, this frame time graph is a lot spikier right here. This frame time graph isn't perfectly smooth, but it's a lot less spiky, showing the 7600 XT taking a 37% advantage in the 1% lows. So initially I was thinking, okay, so are we going above 12 gigabytes of VRAM? Is that the cause? Because oftentimes if you spill over VRAM, that causes issues in the 1% lows, but I'm actually not really seeing any evidence that we're spilling over VRAM, because on the 6700 XT, which has 12 gigabytes, we're only reporting a little over 8 gigabytes of allocation and 8 gigabytes of actual usage. And the 7600 XT is reporting pretty much exactly the same, VRAM results, which again is under 12, even on the card that has 16. So it doesn't seem like we can explain the 1% lows issue on the 6700 XT by VRAM amount. So instead, I would just say it's some sort of a difference between the optimizations for this game on the 7000 series versus the 6000 series. And we continue to see that issue at 1080p low settings, since neither GPU was getting a super high frame rate. If you go down to low settings, we're now getting around 60 FPS, 64 versus 60, and it's an advantage to the 7600 XT. And the 1% lows are also an advantage for the 7600 XT at 32 versus 17. Again, the spiky frame time graph for the last generation product. If we move up to 1440p resolution, we're now seeing the GPUs tied at the averages with 34. The 1% lows are still a bit better on the on the newer GPU by 12% here, 19 versus 17. Both look fairly spiky here, though. So in this case, neither one of them is super amazing on the 1% lows. If we go ahead and kick on FSR quality at the high settings at 1440p, now both GPUs are jumping not quite to 60, but fairly close. We're at 56 versus 55 now, 2% lead for the newer product. However, the 1% lows are again a bit spikier on the 6700 XT on that frame time graph, and giving a 28% advantage to the 1% lows on the 7600 XT. So for whatever reason, the game seems to be running a bit spikier on the last generation product, whether that's game optimization, driver optimization, not sure. Now, at 1440p low settings, we can get 41 FPS on on both GPUs average, but again, we're seeing the 1% lows better on the 7600 XT. But again, both frame time graphs look pretty bad. It's just worse on the 6700 XT. And if we kick on FSR quality on the 1440p low settings, now we're actually seeing the 7600 XT newer generation product take an 11% advantage at 70 versus 63 in the averages. But again, the 1% lows are even more dramatic at 36 FPS versus 16. And again, both frame time graphs do look kind of spiky, but it looks a lot more spiky on the 6700 XT. Now, I've seen a lot of my AMD GPUs have some frame time spike issues in my test area on Alan Wake 2. So it's not that it isn't happening on other GPUs, it just seemed worse on the 6700 XT relatively. But let's jump into Cyberpunk. Now, Cyberpunk, we're back to having the 6700 XT take the lead in the averages, but only by 5% here, 89 versus 85. And actually in the 1% lows, we're seeing the 7600 XT take the lead, but it's not some dramatic spiky difference, 66 versus 61. If we move up to 1440p Ultra, the GPUs are again performing pretty similarly. We're seeing 52 FPS on the 7600 XT and 54 on the 6700 XT, 4% lead for the older GPUs, so pretty much a tie, and especially since the 1% lows are 2%, 1 FPS advantage for the newer generation product at 43 versus 42. In general, Cyberpunk, at least when you're not ray tracing, has been a very good benchmark title for the 7000 series, so I think that's just what we're seeing here. Now, the 1440p high settings, again dropping down to high to try to hit 60 FPS here, we're now seeing 61 FPS on the newer product and 65 on the older, so 7% advantage for the 6700 XT. And here we're also seeing the older product leading in the 1% lows by 6% at 54 versus 51. Now, what if we jump into Starfield? Well, here's another one where I'm seeing the 7000 series product taking a large lead. This time it's 52 FPS versus 41 on the 6700 XT, which actually comes out to a 27% advantage, despite being an 11 FPS difference. And the 1% lows are also showing a similar lead at 43 FPS versus 34. This is 1080p Ultra settings. If we go up to 1440p Ultra settings, we're still seeing the newer 7000 series product taking the advantage at 40 versus 34. And the 1% lows are 34 versus 29. So an 18% lead for the newer product in the averages and a 17% lead for the newer product in the 1% lows. Now, neither one's actually doing great at these settings though, right? 40 FPS and 34. So if you go ahead and kick on FSR quality on the 1440p Ultra settings, we're now jumping to 50 FPS on the 7600 XT and 41 on the 6700 XT, so 22% lead for the newer product. And neither GPU's hitting 60 FPS yet, and also this is one of the city areas, so a lot of the actual combat zones and things like that do perform better than the new Atlantis city area. But let's go ahead and jump into Boulders Gate 3. At 1080p Ultra, we're seeing a 17% advantage for the 6700 XT. And I think I have the wrong 1% lows on here. Don't look, guys. It's wrong. Because if you actually look at the actual 1% lows up here, I think I just forgot to overwrite the Starfield ones there. Anyway, now it looks like we are at the correct numbers, okay, for a 1440p test. All right, there we go. Sorry. Type those all in by hand. So it looks like I missed that one last time. Anyway, 1440p Ultra in Boulders Gate 3. We're seeing the 6700 XT, again, taking 18% lead at 79 versus 67, and the 1% lows are also leading at by 11% this time at 49 versus 44. So we're back to the older generation product on top here. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 I'm testing out the basic settings since I'm thinking you're probably going to go for higher frame rates, competitive edge, that kind of a thing. So at 1080p basic settings, we're seeing a 6% lead in the averages for the older GPU at 222 FPS versus 210, so they're both doing great. But the 1% lows are more noticeable lead at 160 versus 135, which is a 19% advantage. Now, if we move up to 1440p resolution, the average FPS difference is now 13%, 168 versus 149, so again, still both doing well. And the 1% lows are a 10% lead for the 6700 XT at 120 versus 109. So not quite as large a lead in the 1% lows as we saw at 1080p, but actually gaining a little bit more ground in the averages. If we move up to Resident Evil 4 Remake to take a look at the RE engine, at 1080p max settings, which does include some ray traced reflections, we're seeing a 21% advantage for the 6700 XT at 80 versus 66. And the 1% lows are an 18% advantage at 71 versus 60. Now, we're performing well, but I'm also going to test it with prioritized graphics, which turns off the ray tracing. Just because, honestly, the ray tracing in this game looks pretty grainy. I'm not a huge fan of it, so I'd rather kind of just have it off. And you can see that the frame rates do bump quite a bit if you do turn it off. And now we're seeing a 129 FPS versus 106, which is a 22% lead for the 6700 XT, although both GPUs are definitely doing very well here. And the 1% lows are 117 versus 97, a 21% advantage for the older hardware. If we move up to 1440p resolution and stay at the prioritized graphics settings, we're now seeing 91 FPS for the 6700 XT versus 76 on the 7600 XT, which is a 20% advantage for the newer product, for the older GPU, and 24% lead in the 1% lows. Now, let's go ahead and pop over to Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. And at 1080p very high settings, we're seeing the GPUs, I'd call it a tie. We're seeing 4% lead in the averages for the older GPU and a 1% lead in, a 3% lead in the 1% lows for the newer GPU. So in other words, you get a very similar experience on both, to be honest. 97 average versus 93 average, and the 1% lows are 68 versus 66. So if we move up to 1440p very high settings, we're now seeing an 11% advantage for the older product at 68 versus 61, and a 4% advantage in the 1% lows for the older GPU at 48 versus 46. So the 6700 XT taking the advantage here, despite this being one of the more VRAM hungry games out there. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to test it, is that this game can use quite a bit of VRAM. If we drop down to the high settings rather than the very high settings, we're now seeing the 6700 XT take a 15% advantage at 78 versus 68, and the 1% lows, 14% advantage for the older card at 58 versus 51. So that's pretty much the testing that I ran on these. So what's my overall conclusion from all of this? Well, we can see that in the vast majority of situations tested, the 6700 XT, the older generation product, is performing better. And in the cases where the 7600 XT, the newer generation product, did take the lead, it wasn't really because of the increased VRAM. In the cases where we saw it having the advantage, I did check the VRAM usage reports and things like that, and that just didn't seem to be the case. It seemed to be the case that those games just must have been more optimized for the 7000 series architecture. So there's some other differences there. But that certainly seemed to be few and far between. The only real big win we saw for the 7600 XT was in Starfield, and it was winning by so much, it felt unexpected to me. So when you see weird results in your testing, sometimes you want to be like, are other people seeing this? So I did pull up at least like one other reviewer's test of Starfield that showed both the 7600 XT and the 7600. So this is from Tech Power Up. And while it's important to note, their results shouldn't line up perfectly with mine, because despite we're testing the same GPUs in the same game, we're likely not running the same test, right? That my little pathway I do through New Atlantis is probably not what Tech Power Up is testing. So you would expect to see differences, but generally, if one GPU is ahead of another one, it's not by a lot. You're still going to see it ahead in other people's testing, unless that one particular test area was kind of a bizarre test area or something like that. So note here that we are seeing them getting the 7600 XT ahead of the 6700 XT, which was not usually the result in their testing. Again, like I was seeing, usually the older generation product was ahead. Starfield is a bit of an outlier, and I'm not the only one seeing that, so I'm just kind of saying, yeah, there are a few games like Starfield where the 7600 XT takes the lead. It's not due to VRAM usage, because the game's not using more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM, but it is taking the advantage there. But those are pretty few and far between. So I would say that while they cost the same, the older product, while it's still available, right, is offering you more performance for the same price. And that's the main reason, and it's been offering that for a long time now, which is the main reason why I think myself and a lot of other people are just not that excited about the 7600 XT, because it's coming in at a price point where we've already had a GPU with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. I'm sure this is 16, but we've already had an AMD GPU offering more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM at about this price point for a long time, and it actually offered more performance. So I would like to see the 7600 XT come down in price. However, unfortunately, I'm worried that we're just going to see the 6700 XT supply dry up. We'll have to see what comes of that. Hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting. Huge thank you to viewers, commenters, subscribers, especially channel members who click the join button to directly support the channel financially. That is absolutely huge. Massive thank you for doing that. And you guys do get channel members do get the little member badges in the comment section. It's easier for you, the way YouTube filters work, it's easier for me to find your comments. I do have some early access to some videos and some members exclusive videos, kind of just some behind the scenes stuff that doesn't make sense to post on the whole channel, that kind of stuff. Anyway, huge thank you to everybody. Hope everyone has an excellent day.